But probably one of the worrying findings that we had, now I don't want to over sensationalize it because this was an isolated case. This was one coach said this. It's not representative of the field as a whole, but it was just interesting that we had one coach who, when I questioned, do you track the menstrual cycle in your athletes? Is it something that you track? They stated that, they do not track the menstrual cycle. They do not discuss it really with their athletes because they said that's a personal thing. But then within 30 seconds was describing how, not at the national level, but at a previous team that they had worked with, they implemented a system of pregnancy testing within their team, that they would pregnancy test all the players at the start of the season and then every 3 weeks after that throughout the season. So that for me was a dissonance, that this coach thought that, okay, to ask people about their menstrual cycle is too personal, but to pregnancy test them every 3 weeks is just fine.
Hi, David, and welcome to Evidence Strong Show. It's my pleasure to have you. If you could briefly introduce yourself.
Hi, Alex. Thanks very much for having me on. Yeah, so I'm an assistant professor of sport and exercise sciences here at Dublin City University. My research area is around sex differences in sport, sex differences in adaptation to exercise, but with a specific focus on the female athlete. So a lot of what I research is around the female athlete, with some female specific issues around, say, the menstrual cycle and hormonal contraceptives and their influence on exercise performance and recovery in some of these metrics. And then also from an applied practice, I am a strength and conditioning coach. I teach across the S&C modules and our undergraduate and postgraduate courses here at DCU. But then I do work as an applied practitioner in strength and conditioning with a background then in powerlifting and strength sport.
That's awesome. That's right up alley of the audience of the show. So I'm very excited to have you. And I invited you to specifically talk about a recently published paper looking at communication styles as reported by strength and conditioning coaches, specifically in rugby. But because rugby is such a powerful sport, it is very similar to strength and conditioning and Olympic weightlifting, powerlifting, even CrossFit. So I think that the lessons you learned in this study may be applicable to strength coaches in general. So if you would introduce us to the study. So what was the aim of the study and why you've done it?
Yeah, so the study that we've just published it's actually the second paper from this particular study, and it was one of my PhD studies. So my PhD looked at tried to answer some of the questions around female-specific S&C or female-specific strength and conditioning programs, because I've worked with female athletes in the past, and people will often say, it's important that we do female-specific programs that are tailored towards. But I always question people, well, what does that mean? I was like, what is female specific? Because from my perspective, when I design a strength and conditioning program, the very first thing I think about is adaptation. What is the goal of the program, and then what principles need to be applied and what methods. So none of those have a sex dimension to them. So I was like, so what do you mean by female specific? So then I started to dig into it, and we do know that in the strength and conditioning literature, it's what we would call androcentric, that the majority of methods we use have been derived in male athletes, and for male athletes. And we know that male and female physiology is quite different, and there are major sex differences between the males and females in structure, anatomy, and physiology that do lead to differences in sports performance. So my thought process was, well, if we know that males and females are very different, and all the methods that we use have been designed for and tested in men, and we're just blindly applying them to women, well, maybe there is a rationale that because of these differences, we might need new approaches or different approaches to strength and conditioning for female athletes. So a lot of these, I had great ambitions for laboratory studies, but then COVID came along, so we had to switch tack a bit. So that brought me back then thinking, well, what are the people in the field doing? Are people actually training women differently to men? And I worked in rugby at the time, so the study that we did, we interviewed 8 head of strength and conditioning coaches. So these are the people at the top international women's rugby team, so women's rugby union. These are the heads of performance or the lead S&Cs working with these top international teams. And the aims were very simple. It was to explore their attitudes and beliefs and practices towards S&C for the female athletes. So basically, to simplify it, I wanted to know, do these coaches train women differently to men when it comes to the strength and conditioning? And if so, why? Why are they doing that? because with very little evidence, if they were training them differently to men, it would be interesting because there's no evidence as yet that we need to do that. So that was the question. So that's what we did. We interviewed 8 of the top S&C coaches, asking them these questions. Do they train women differently to men? If so, why? And what unique differences or challenges do they face when coaching women's teams? So out of those coaches, we had 6 men, 2 women were the ones in those positions. So very in-depth interviews. And then from that, we do what we call a thematic analysis, basically where we pick apart that script. We listen to the interviews again and again. We pick apart the transcript and we try to identify some commonalities and some themes that emerges from that. And again, it's a very iterative process. We go again and again and we try to dig into read between the lines of what are these coaches doing and why are they doing it? What are their beliefs and motivations?
So what was the first paper about?
So I went in there and what I was expecting to hear was, these coaches may be saying, yeah, I account for the menstrual cycle. I do train women differently to men based on X, Y, Z. But what I found that technical side of stuff, about do they program differently? Is intensity different? Is volume different? There wasn't a whole lot of discussion around that a lot of them are very much, I don't do things differently. Maybe my methods I modify slightly here and there. But when we looked at all the data, there was tons and tons of data. How they coach is actually different male to female. So what they do in terms of the nuts and bolts of the program mightn't be different, but a lot of them then spoke about, well, how I engage with the athletes, the interpersonal, the communication does differ male to female. So that's why it naturally ended up being 2 separate papers. One that focused on kind of the nuts and bolts, the technical aspect of S&C, and then the other around the coaching style and the interpersonal style, that most recent paper around how they communicate with their athletes.
So do you think we're ready to listen? What have you found on the communication side?
Yeah, so it was interesting that our coaches were a large geographical spread. So we people, northern hemisphere, southern hemisphere, huge geographical spread. But yet the experiences were kind of universal across all the coaches. So when the first and second coach I interviewed started expressing some of these views, I thought, okay, that's interesting. But then it's nearly like we're all speaking to each other because there were the same answers coming through again and again. So a lot of the coaches expressed that, what their programs look like, the actual, rep that doesn't change much male to female. They just modify the load based on, relative strength and stuff like that. But they express how I coach them is differently. My presence, the way I speak to them is different. So we had some common themes come out from that. One of the big things that came out of it was buy-in. How you get athletes to buy into the program. So what we mean by that buy-in is that the athletes, believe in the program, they want to do it, and they see the importance of the gym work or the strength and conditioning approach. Because we can never forget that these athletes are on their international rugby team because they like to play rugby and they're good at playing rugby. They're not there because they like the gym so there's many athletes, when you work as a coach, like even I come from a strength sport background, a powerlifting background, where the sport is the gym. It's the lifting is the sport. So for us, that's what we love, where you will have athletes that they love playing the game, but the gym is just something that they do because they have to. So it's important that they understand the importance of it and to get that buy-in. So there's 2 main barriers to getting that buy-in that the coach expressed. One that we would probably expect is this hesitancy or deleterious attitude towards gym work or resistance training from our female athletes. That this fear of getting, too big, too bulky, putting on too much muscle, and for a number of reasons people might have that. But it was getting over that fear of lifting heavy weight. So why some of the female athletes might have that fear, there is that, fear of putting on large amounts of muscle mass, which for anyone that's ever tried to gain muscle, you don't gain it by accident. It's not an easy thing to do. So, that's usually a fear that can be eradicated quite quickly. But also there's probably some societal influences then as well, that the coaches said, when you work with male athletes, you're usually telling them to maybe take a bit of weight off the bar. And it's like, okay, your technique is not great there. Take a bit of weight off and improve it. Where it's the converse with your female athletes, you're spending most of your time being like, I think you can go a bit heavier here. I don't think you're pushing it. So that was one. But the other thing then that came through very strongly was that in general, women athletes, female athletes need to understand the rationale of what they are doing. That they will not blindly follow a program. Where one coach described it as, if you tell a group of male athletes to run through the wall, they will just run through the wall. They don't question you. Where the women athletes will say, well, can I not go around the wall, or can I not go over? Why do we have to run through the wall? So that's something that the coaches spoke about, that in order to get buy-in, to get their women athletes to buy into the program and really commit and be motivated to do the strength and conditioning program, that they had to spend more time explaining why it's important. And then the coaches said some things around, discussing menstrual cycle is obviously a unique thing in the women's game that's not there in the men's game. And then professional boundaries, and I think scope of practice was something that came through strongly as well. So some of the coaches described that, in the men's environment, they'll be much more hands-on with the athletes, that if someone's technique was bad, that they would grab someone's shoulders, like, no, you need to be here, and physically put them into the position they want to. Where in female environment, they'd be much more hesitant to do that. And especially when it's a male coach in a female environment, much more hesitant to do that kind of thing. So I suppose that as an overview is kind of the main differences they found, that when working in women's environments, that the athletes are much more inquisitive. They need to understand what's going on. They will question much more than follow a program blindly. The team dynamics, the codependence on can have a big issue, or a big influence on team morale. And then, how they actually coach tend to not be as dictative or authoritative, and be more conscious of maybe scope of practice and professionalism.
You mentioned that females tend to be more codependent on the teammates. What do you mean exactly?
So a couple of coaches expressed this issue that, that's where the title comes from, that, male athletes play well to feel good, that, they go in, it's about the performance. If they perform well, they're happy. Where female athletes, they need to be in a good, positive. This was now, again, it's just perception of a coach. They're like, they need to feel good to perform well, that it comes the other way. So that codependence was, coaches expressed that, if you've 20 players on a men's team and 2 or 3 of them are in a bad mood, it doesn't really affect the team as a whole. They're kind of left to their own devices, and the other men are like, they're just in a bad mood, bad. Where in female team, it was perceived that if you have 2 or 3 people that are in a bad mood, it nearly infects the team much more than all of a sudden everyone's in a bad mood, or the team dynamic, the team morale, that performance of the whole team can dip, and you can have a poor performance. So it's much more important. That was what was highlighted, that in men's teams it doesn't happen as much, but in women's teams, where you can have a couple of people might have some issue with a coach, or might be bringing some sort of negativity to a session, it tends to be much more infectious in that environment than in the men's environment.
I would like to talk a little bit about female issues, specifically coach-athlete communication on the topic of menstrual cycle.
In our first paper, when we talked about this idea of phase-based training, or modulating training around the menstrual cycle, a lot of the coaches took a very pragmatic approach in it, where they acknowledged, it's not feasible in elite rugby to do phase-based training. And they acknowledge, the evidence is limited and doesn't show any, superior benefit to modulating around, say, or putting higher volumes in the follicular versus luteal phase or anything like that. So the coaches, were pragmatic and said, even if that was something that was beneficial to do, you have, 20 different menstrual cycles in the team at one point. There's no feasible way logistically you can do it. So all the coaches did say that they are comfortable discussing menstrual cycle, and that they feel, it's just one of these things that is ever present in their team, and that it's important to create an environment that nobody has any issue discussing it if they want to discuss it. Because there is, I make the argument sometimes that it's very easy to say, oh, the menstrual cycle is taboo in sport, but I don't really think it is. In modern sport, I think most environments, adult environments, are comfortable discussing the menstrual cycle and bringing it up. So all the coaches said, it's important that the athletes feel comfortable, that they can say, if they're experiencing some symptoms related to their menstrual cycle or anything like that. But how they deal with it is very much on an auto-regulated, approach, that if an athlete comes to them and says, I'm feeling a bit shitty today, or I have these symptoms, that they're like, okay, we'll auto-regulate. Let's get you in the gym, and maybe we'll take a bit of the load off the bar, or maybe we'll reduce volume. But it's done on an ad hoc basis. It's not programmed in advance, I like that. So they're very receptive to it. They will acknowledge and validate the players' experiences, but like that, they will just take a pragmatic approach and they'll auto-regulate on an individual basis as needed, which personally I think is probably the correct approach to take, because that's just good coaching, really, isn't it? It's, having an open line of communication with your athletes and then coaching and auto-regulating based on the feedback you're getting in real time. So I think that's just good coaching overall.
Did you find, I know that you had only 2 female coaches, but did you find anything different from the perspective of female coaches versus male coaches?
So again, we can't dig too much into that because it is a small sample size overall and it's only 2. That being said, yes, only out of the 8 coaches, only 1 coach expressed the desire to experiment with and implement phase-based training in their team, and that was one of the female coaches. So that is where that's coming from. But that coach also had some strong attitudes towards, hormonal contraceptives that weren't backed up by literature, so some strong. So some of the places where that coach was gaining their knowledge from would be poorer resources, I would say. I won't name specifically the websites or the individuals that they were getting their information from, but wouldn't be from evidence-based sources. But no, in general, that was that one coach. So whether that's being driven by the factor female, we can't say. It might be just coincidence that they were the one coach that's been exposed to this line of thinking and they just happened to be female. In general, no, I don't think there was any major differences. Like the opinions of the coaches didn't actually differ all that much, which was interesting given that they're all in such different environments and different cultural environments, that the teams were quite common across all coaches.
Would you feel comfortable discussing what the evidence says about hormonal contraception and elite performance?
Yes, so we've done some research in that area. So if you look at some of the research done by, Kirsty Elliott-Sale, by Kelly McNulty, some of their meta-analysis work, it would suggest that, the oral contraceptive pill doesn't have a major influence on athletic performance. It may have a trivial impact in pill users versus non-pill users, but the evidence is quite poor. There's no strong evidence to say that the contraceptive pill either improves or negatively impacts performance in both strength and aerobic measures. We, towards the end of last year, again this year, I'm trying to think exactly when it was published, released a meta-analysis where we reviewed the literature around the effect of hormonal contraceptives on adaptation to resistance exercise training. So people that are doing, 8, 12, 16 weeks of resistance training, pill users versus non-pill users, is there any difference on hypertrophy, strength and power outcomes? And we found that there's no difference between users and non-users. Interestingly, we just wanted to look at hormonal contraceptives as a whole. The pill is really the only one that's been investigated. Now, the oral contraceptive pill is the most commonly used contraceptive in women of athletic age. So we still don't know about, the coil or the injection or patches or these other methods of delivery. But based on the current body of evidence, both our research and previous research, there's no strong evidence to suggest that the oral contraceptive pill has an impact on performance or has an impact on chronic adaptation. So that it will positively or negatively influence hypertrophy, power or strength outcomes in response to resistance training. Now, there is more research to be done. There's not a whole lot of studies in the area. We do need to do more. And also, we need to look at different forms of contraceptives, different generations, different formulations, different dosages. There's a lot of different caveats and nuance to that. But based on the evidence to date, if someone is saying, oh, you should or should not be on the pill for, athletic performance, that's not an evidence-based opinion. There's not enough evidence to make that comment one way or another. And also, I believe that's far outside the scope of most sports science and strength and conditioning professionals to make a comment on whether a woman should be on the contraceptive pill or not. That's not within your scope of practice. That's for them and their medical professionals. And also, women take the oral contraceptives for a variety of different motivations and reasons, not just to avoid pregnancy. So that's a very personal thing to an individual, and I don't think it's in the scope of a coach to be making recommendations one way or another on that.
The last theme in the personal approach was the scope of practice and boundaries. Did something interesting come up in terms of scope of practice for male versus female?
We had some interesting things here. So the coaches did express that this is something they're more aware of when working with female athletes than males, professional boundaries, scope of practice. So I talked about how that coach expressed, I won't put my hands on the players as easily, that they'll always seek permission, which, look, that should be the case across both men and women. We shouldn't be putting our hands on athletes without permission. But he said he would be very cognizant of it. He would always say to an athlete, is it okay if I put my hand here or I do this? So that was something he was just more hyper aware of in the female game. And also, when it came to discussions around menstrual cycle, around contraceptive, coaches are much were aware that, they have a scope of practice, that it's important to know when to refer to the medical professional or when to refer, and to understand what is inside their lane and what is outside their lane when it comes to their practice. But probably one of the, worrying findings that we had. Now, I don't want to over-sensationalize it, because this was an isolated case. This was one coach said this. It's not representative of the field as a whole. But it was just interesting that we had one coach who, when I questioned, do you track the menstrual cycle in your athletes? Is this something that you track? They stated that, they do not track the menstrual cycle. They do not discuss it really with their athletes, because they said that's a personal thing. We, as the management, we can't decide that we're going to monitor the menstrual cycle. So that was the statement. But then within 30 seconds was describing how, not at the national level, but at a previous team that they had worked with, they implemented a system of pregnancy testing within their team, that they would pregnancy test all the players at the start of the season and then every 3 weeks after that throughout the season. So that for me was a dissonance, that this coach thought that, okay, to ask people about their menstrual cycle is too personal, but to pregnancy test them every 3 weeks is just fine. And the reason behind that is, when we dug into it, was first safety concerns. They had concerns that if a player became pregnant and was unaware of it and then was to subsequently get injured or miscarry or something in the course of training, who would be liable for that? They need to be aware of that and to do it. But then secondly, and more concerningly, it was to discourage unsafe sex practices. So the coach described that, these young women, they're sexually active, that they want to discourage unwanted pregnancies in that team, or discourage pregnancies. And they likened a player becoming pregnant, an unplanned pregnancy, to an ACL injury. So they described that if a player gets pregnant, it's the same as an ACL. They're gone for 9 months plus 4, so 13 months total. And then if they do come back, they're in worse shape than when they left. So that was the description of what a unplanned pregnancy would mean in a team. To describe that this unplanned pregnancy is the same as an athlete having a devastating ACL injury. So I think that was a concerning finding, that some of these attitudes still exist in what we see as elite sport. So, and that I hope for anyone that is listening, they will realize that systematic pregnancy testing in a team is probably not something we should be doing, nor is probably not something that is in the scope of practice of a strength and conditioning coach to be involved in.
Wow, that's shocking.
Yeah, and as I said, it thankfully was an isolated case, which was one coach described it, but obviously there are some strong ethical concerns we would have with a practice such as that. I think we can create an environment where athletes are comfortable to discuss these things. They know who they can go to know who the medical professional is that they speak to. Like, as a strength and conditioning coach, if an athlete doesn't want to discuss their menstrual cycle or pregnancy or any medical issue, really, an athlete should, if they do not wish to discuss any medical thing or any medical issue with me, they shouldn't need to. I'm not a medical professional. I'm a strength and conditioning coach. That is not my concern. It's not my scope of practice. I'm happy, for athletes to say, oh, I have cramps today, I have low back pain because, I'm on my period or a PMS. And that's great. That's, from a coaching perspective, that's fine. We can modulate for that. And if an athlete said, is there anything I can do to, alleviate my PMS symptoms? That's not my scope of practice. I have no right or medical training to make recommendations there. So it's about knowing when to refer out. What is your wheelhouse? There's a difference between a conversation between a coach and an athlete and a coach giving medical advice or, intervening in a medical way. So I think we have to draw the line there around what is clear scope of practice. And in fairness, the NSCA, ASCA, UKFCA, all these leading strength and conditioning bodies have clear codes of conduct of what the role of the S&C coach is, and we should all be aware of those in our environments.
Would you have any opinions on building, as a coach, building a network of trusted and well-educated health and allied health professionals that you can refer to and work with?
Yep, I think so. And I think that happens organically in a lot of situations, that coaches, get to know different people in different areas. But like that, I think to my own practice, I know this year with a team I was involved in, there was one athlete who to me was displaying many symptoms of RED, of relative energy deficiency in sport. And like that, I am not a dietitian, I'm not a medical doctor, so I cannot diagnose or that, but I'm aware of the symptoms. So very quickly, I know a sports doctor who specializes in RED, so I can ring them and say and refer someone to them. I was like, can I send an athlete to you for a consultation? That's where we need to go. And I think it's important to, as a sports scientist, I sometimes describe us as general practitioner, so a GP doctor. I don't know what it's called in Australia, but it'd be a GP here, where you go to them. They're not a specialist in any one area, but they have a very broad range of knowledge that if someone comes with a certain number of symptoms, they can say, I think it's this, and I know the person who I can refer you to who's a specialist to really investigate that deeply. That's where I see it as a sports scientist, that I have a little bit of knowledge in a lot of areas, maybe, and I'm a specialist, maybe one or two narrow areas of my own speciality. But in general, if someone comes displaying a few symptoms of RED, I'm like, okay, I know that is potentially RED, I'll refer to that. Someone comes with the voice, something around menstrual dysfunction, I'm like, okay, I know who to refer you to for that. Similarly, if someone, was having pain in their ankle, I'd refer them to the physiotherapist. We know where to send. So I think it's important to have an appreciation of, especially when working with female athletes, with coaches, with athletes, what are some of the red flags you want to look out for in certain of these major issues we tend to see in female athletes, and who do you refer to when you see these red flags?
Do you think we covered everything you wanted to say about the study?
I think so. As I said, it was interesting that coaches really don't program that differently male to female. They don't see a reason that you should be changing, exercises, intensity, volumes, just scaling it based on the individual. But how they coach is different. I think that's something that students or younger coaches coming up should understand, that even when I have people come and shadow me or intern with me, I'll often point out that, look, the program they're doing, it's very simple. The student would often write a program similar to what I write. I was like, what will make you a good coach is your ability to coach, not to write programs. It's your ability to actually create an environment conducive to performance. So that's probably the big thing, that these top coaches are what I would often describe them as, the ability to be a chameleon, to change how they coach, how they communicate, because yes, there are differences between men and women, but also if you have 30 women in a room, that's 30 different personalities. You need to be able to know that athlete responds well to a bit more high energy. That athlete likes me to stand off a bit more, be a bit more reserved. So that's what will differentiate you as a coach, your ability to adapt your coaching style to the athlete in front of you.
Awesome. What do you have, maybe 3 of the most important lessons for the coaches from the study?
Yeah, so some of the lessons that these coaches experience. Number one, to get buy-in, female athletes seem to need to understand why they're doing it. So you need to get good at explaining why you're doing the exercises and where it improves their performance. Female athletes in general tend to be a bit more hesitant to lift heavy weight and to do high intensity work. Some of the ways I like to get around that might be like the velocity-based training and giving them a target to work towards on a velocity. It's like, I want you to keep going up in weight till that hits 0.3 meters a second or something like this. That can be a way to drive it. And then the third thing, and this is not just in women's sport, but across the board, it's important to be aware of your professional boundaries and your scope of practice as a coach, and not to step outside those boundaries.
Excellent. Very well. Thank you so much, David.
A pleasure, Alex. Thank you very much for having me on.